thank you to all those who are able to hang out, who stayed through the fantastic keynote speaker, and now for the panel. And thank you to all the new faces that are in the room. We filled the room right back up, which is exactly what we like to see. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists, and then each panelist will get about 10 minutes or so to talk, and then we will have a little bit of time for question and answer afterwards. I have panelists in a certain order. We can go in any from right to left as after I introduce us, okay? So as I introduce you, if you could just kind of say hi to the audience so that our audience can put a face with the name. On the poster for the event, we will start with Corey Ring, coming to us from the U.S. El Salvador sister cities, also representing the Democratic Socialists in Sacramento. We also have Mariana Rivera from the Zapatista Coalition of Sacramento. Francisco Dominguez, who is a photographer, artist, and journalist, over here. And Dr. Maria Vargas, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Ethnic Studies at Sacramento State. Dr. Sarabia, an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology here at Sacramento State. And Dr. Limon, a professor of English at Sacramento City College. And before I forget, my name is Christopher Towler. I am faculty in the Department of Political Science. I will now turn the floor over to our esteemed panelists, and I'll come back up here and take questions afterwards. Thank you again. Let's give our panel a round of applause as we get started.
Cool, I get to go first. Hello. I wanted to say thank you to the organizers for having us, and thank you especially to Dr. Luther for coming here and sharing with us. I think that was a very powerful opening talk, and I'm going to talk about El Salvador specifically. I worked for U.S. El Salvador Sister Cities, which is a network that came out of the Civil War in El Salvador in order to have solidarity across borders, and so there are cities continuing to be sistered with communities in El Salvador, organized communities. And so I have experience from living and working in El Salvador, from being half Salvadoran, and continuing to do solidarity work on this side of the border. So I wanted to have the first point about El Salvador and this topic, right? Neocolonialism and resistance and indigenous communities on the move. In order to understand the current migration crisis, I mean, it was a front page article this morning in the New York Times that the border is at a breaking point, which is ridiculous because it's a man-made thing, and so how can it be broken? And so you got to understand, El Salvador has never, and just like Honduras and just like many countries in Latin America, has never existed without the interference of U.S. government and U.S. foreign policy, specifically under the Monroe Doctrine, which the U.S. government today still follows. You can just look at a recent CNN interview with John Bolton a few days ago, basically citing the same policy. Then there's also the key thing you got to understand about El Salvador and the U.S. and the U.S. Forces there is that we can't have it both ways, right? From the very beginning of Salvadoran independence, we and U.S. involvement in Latin America, it's been, like Dr. Luther said, to try to take resources from these countries. And so when people in El Salvador were trying to bring social justice to their country in the 70s and 80s, this was when the U.S. government was giving $1.1 million a day to the Salvadoran military to stamp out communism, right? And so this began one of the first waves of mass migration to the United States from El Salvador. Then the U.S. backed the rich, the military, and their death squads, to the point that Archbishop Oscar Romero was killed by these forces in 1980, and he was trying to avoid what would later become a civil war that forced that migration. And so the war initiated this process. Now there's more than 2 million Salvadorans living in the United States. And since the war, U.S. policies have continued to increase these push factors, right? So, for example, we've got the Central American Free Trade Agreement, which has completely devastated poor farmers' ability, or campesinos' ability to continue their traditional lifestyle of subsistence farming. So that's driven people to go to the cities where there's been increased in free trade factories, right? And of course, people are told to be grateful for the opportunity to be employed in subhuman working conditions, and not allowed to organize for labor rights, because these are under free trade zones, so the laws of the country don't apply there. And of course, these are all, this capital is not staying in the country, it's going out to international corporations. And so this is just one example, and it's not tied just to El Salvador, right? We see it all over Central America and Latin America. And then, so we have this economic exploitation over in El Salvador and in other Latin American countries. And yet, when people escape that, right, and other factors like violence that I'll get to, we deny legitimate claims of asylum here. And so we can't continue to have it both ways, right? We are constantly trying to deter immigration, as if a more militarized border is gonna stop this, right? Without really interrogating the root causes and the historical causes of this migration path. And so the legalization of asylum needs to happen, but people also need to understand how our foreign policy impacts our domestic experiences here, right? It's all tied. You can't have one without the other. And so when Salvadorans are coming to the United States, they're being pushed by a myriad of forces, right? So you've got the economic forces, but you've also got family connections. So it's a pull factor, right? And then you've got the gangs. And the gangs also have a U.S. Connection. And the gangs are also a particularly Salvadoran phenomenon because of how they were born in LA, and with, when people are feeling marginalized, they join groups, right? And so that's what one of the gangs were. It was a reclamation of space and identity. And so when our extremely American heritage of policing and jailing of people got overhand, right? President Bill Clinton was complicit in getting more and more people deported and sent back to El Salvador, right? And that's where we see the birth of the MS-13 and Barrio 18 and all these gangs that are now this supposed transnational menace. Although they're not really they're different than drug cartels. They're actually much more localized. And so the gang issue is something that people have really no idea how to tackle, because it's coming from, again, a similar perspective of, well, if we can just enforce it, if we can just use force to make the problem go away, to deter these behaviors, then it'll work. And clearly that's not the case, right? So when dealing with this, we got to understand the root causes and effects, and trying to find holistic ways to tackle it. So I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here when I'm talking about U.S. intervention in foreign countries, especially Latin America. But you got to understand it, like Dr. Luther was saying before. If we don't understand it, we'll be blind to what comes next, right? Our history is deeply tied to our future. So I'm gonna leave it there because I think I made the key points I wanted to make, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
I'll just sneak back in here. Next, we're going to hear from Mariana Rivera from the Zapatista Coalition.
Yeah. Thank you. Good afternoon. Buenas tardes. I'm Mariana. I'm part of the Zapatista Solidarity Coalition for 25 years and 2 months. We started doing this work right away. We didn't have internet yet back then, just barely. But we did have a fax, and somebody faxed us the first declaration of war on January 1st, 1994. We got it, and I know my husband and I went home and we translated it, and by the next day it was around the world in English. I remember that. That was our first little aportación, our first little participation. And the Zapatistas rose up on January 1st, 1994 because of NAFTA, right? These guys are pretty sharp in terms of bringing forward, I would call it a creative politic, in terms of being able to take a look at what's going on and use it to teach, to reach out to the people of the world. So the Zapatistas organized for many years. They rose up in arms. It was a mostly indigenous army with some mestizo participation as well. A third of their army were women. That's pretty badass, right? Okay, so a lot of the women participated as well. And they fought. There was a break. They had a break. The government's okay, we won't do this, because there was so much response around the world in terms of solidarity. Listening to what went on, we closed the Mexican consulate. Those are just things that we did here in Sacramento, but it went on all around the world. There were huge demonstrations in Mexico City, all around Mexico, in support of the indigenous who stood up. The ones who, they call themselves the smallest ones, the littlest ones, los más pequeños. They suffered from, I was looking back at that first declaration, and they were fighting for housing, for land, for work, for healthcare, for food, for education, for justice, for dignity. All of those things that are like, I think Mario always says it's in the International Declaration of Human Rights. All those basic necessities, okay? So that's who they were. And they negotiated, like a ceasefire. They met with the government and tried to come up with things that would respect indigenous rights, and they kept on moving through. They had this kind of military structure, but they were also led by their communities. They had representatives in this Indigenous Revolutionary Committee and clandestine committee with representatives from all the communities. So all of the communities participate in all the decision making and all of that. So anyway, it's so much information to talk about the Zapatistas. I'm hoping you will read some things. I read another article, some friends of ours, Maria Elena Martinez Torres. If you look her up and look at her writing, she's got some excellent analysis that we can use for your class. But excellent analysis, and her ex-partner, Peter Rosset, R-O-S-S-E-T, I think, Rosset. incredible analysis. They were the first people we heard speak about Chiapas and who knew what they were talking about. That was in January of '94. Excellent writers. They continue to do the research and work. Peter works for Via Campesina, and Maria Elena is a professor, I believe. And I'm not sure at which university now, because I read a lot of articles by her again last night just to refresh my memory. So they've continued to exist. It's 25 years. They just had their 25th anniversary. That's a long time, you know, that they've been up. And they've been, they created what they wanted to, you know, create. They have housing, they have work, they have their own government, they have an autonomous structure. In all those different little communities, they have their own, what they say goes, ¿verdad? El pueblo manda, right? They run stuff. And so, as I was looking at this and thinking of, I never use the word colonization or colonialism. I don't think of it that way, I guess. And so I was, what are they talking? Okay, I know what they're talking about, but I look at it as neoliberalism, the kind of capitalist system that exists right now around the world. That system exists in Mexico, and that's what they're confronting. And you know, everybody's really excited right now because there's a new president in Mexico, AMLO, right? López Obrador, the new president, you know. He's going to be the good guy. He's going to be the left government. And the words that come out from him sound like it's going to be a progressive government. So it gives you hope. And, you know, we're always critical of everything, but it made us have hope, you know, only a little bit, you know, still with that reservation behind it. And I guess what I'm getting to is the Zapatistas are getting ready to defend themselves. They feel like they're going to be under attack. This last Sunday, we heard one of the congressmen from Mexico speak here in Sacramento, and he was talking about, oh, the Zapatistas, you know, they're just over there in Chiapas. They're not doing anything. You know, he was just dissing them big time. You know, that they're nothing. So I went back and read all the articles again and all these statements from the Zapatistas, and they also formed a thing called the National Indigenous Congress. Way back a long time ago they started, and that meant they were trying to get all the different indigenous groups within Mexico, all the different tribal people, all of them, to come together in an organization. Besides that organization, that National Indigenous Congress also formed like a political committee, a national political committee to do their political work. And what they're coming, I just read through all their statements last night and this morning, and they're really clear that they feel like they're going to be attacked. And the things that they're worried about are the following. One of them is the I don't know if you heard about the Tren Maya, the Maya train. They want to have a train that goes to all the different indigenous Mayan communities from Chiapas to Quintana Roo, over to Cancun, you know, the whole little, you know, so the tourists can come and visit, and they want to build big fancy hotels and have the indigenous work as the waiters and waitresses and hotel room cleaners, et cetera, et cetera. It's the same project that Peña Nieto, the past president, all the presidents in the past have wanted to do the same kind of project. But this guy, who everybody believes in and trusts and hopes that he's going to be the good guy, the good president, the left president, is saying he still wants to do that. Okay, and the next one is they're looking at mining, they're looking at planting millions of trees, you know, in the Istma, the Tehuantepec. They're planning lots of things, these mega projects that the indigenous feel like are going to hurt them. So I'm going to stop there and ask Mario to come quickly and a little bit of time. Sorry, Mario. Mario's also with our group, and he went down on the for the anniversary, the 25th anniversary. So he can tell you about what he learned about how the Zapatistas want to respond and why.
As Mariana was saying, there's a huge wave of hope. Last night I was listening to some of the programs from Mexico, and the new president has a 90% approval rating. If you can believe that, compared to what we've got here. But in spite of his talk and how he says he's not a neoliberal, the contradiction is that he is supporting these big mega projects, just like Dr. Luther was talking about. This Maya train is a series of hotels, resorts, et cetera, that are going to come and displace indigenous peoples. And another big project is a big trans-isthmus across the Isthmus of Panama. The Mexico, there's that little skinny part down in Mexico that they're planning on building huge rail lines across. So I don't know if you know the new big cargo ships that come from China and stuff, they won't go through the Panama Canal. They're so gigantic. And so there's been talk about another canal. But instead of a canal, they're just trying to build a rail shipment to just bring traffic across. So again, the Zapatistas, who, as Mariana said, have been struggling for actually 35 years, because in secret they organized in this hidden, forgotten part of Mexico, 10 years underground in secret before they declared war on the government and sent out the declaration that Mariana talked about. And they feel, and their leader was very, very outspoken at the anniversary celebration on January 1st, that it just hit me in the heart, because in a sense, I feel like we in the United States are in the same position. He was saying, why is it that after all we've done, all we've reached out and asked, they've traveled all over Mexico, they've gone around the world to different places, why is it that they're still kind of isolated, they're still harassed by the government, they're still attacked by paramilitaries? When will the people rise up and realize that, as Dr. Luther says, we have to feel the pain of others and do something about it? Thank you.
Okay, we're going to next hear from Francisco Dominguez.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Francisco Dominguez. I brought some photos to show you guys today. First of all, I want to say I'm very happy to be here. Dr. Luther, I heard him speak a couple of years ago here in Sacramento. They were raising money for the hospital. And we should feel very honored to be here to hear his words today. He lives in a country that's very dangerous, and I'm happy to be here today. Also, we'll just get started here. I wanted to say that Sacramento State has a permanent collection of my archive, of my photography and my silkscreen posters, and it's down the hall here at the archive next to the library. I'm going to start off with some farm worker photography that I did. My father was a bracero worker here that came here in this country in the 50s to work because there was a shortage of workers after World War II. And my father worked here in the Delta area as a farm worker, and he wanted to stay. My father wanted to stay here in this country. So they had another program called the U.S. Army in Korea. So my father joined the Army. They said he'd give him the citizenship, and he made it back. He was shot twice in the legs, but he made it back. And then I'm here today because he got his citizenship. He met my mother here in Sacramento. So that got me interested in doing the farm worker photography. This is a picture of child labor in Winters, California. The young man on the right, Javier, he's 16 years old. He probably works 60 hours a week. I did a series in Winters, California. These are almond workers, almond sorters. They're not children, but they're working, during the harvest, they work about 60 hours a week. Also very hard. They stand up all day. These are some photos from the border. This is the old border fence. This is San Isidro, Mexico on the other side, Pacific Ocean. Now there's a triple fence there. This picture was done, I think, in 2003. That's one of the things that you need to understand about the immigration situation. It's been going on for a long time. That's why I'm talking about the Bracero program. Okay, this didn't happen a year ago, 2 years ago. It goes way back. President Bush, Clinton, all of them. So now there's a triple fence there. This is a Border Patrol station in Douglas, Arizona. As a photographer, I went with a public affairs, public service officer from the Border Patrol. He took me on a tour into the jail, you name it. In 1990, I went to Guatemala. And first, our group, we stopped in Chiapas to the refugee camps. And just the complete sadness of the situation. People living in the mountains with virtually nothing. I asked them, how come you're not wearing your beautiful clothing? They said, because this is not our country. They said, we have it packed up, but when we go home, then we'll put it back on. This is not our country. So from there, the Mexican government told them that they just couldn't stay there forever, that they had to become Mexican citizens or go back to Guatemala. A lot came here, or they went to Canada or to Europe because of the genocide that was taking place. 300,000 Guatemalan citizens were killed by their own government, with the complicity of our government also. Yeah, I'll never forget this. Actually, I had a show here at Sac State in the Student Union Gallery in 1991, upstairs. And I titled the show, Mayan Refugees 500 Years Later. This is on the border in Juarez. I was with the delegation there looking at a displacement of a community up in the mountains above Juarez, and they're all maquila workers in these communities, and we were driving, and I told the driver to stop the car. You know, I seen this image. So I got out and I did this photograph. These crosses were from 10 women that had been killed. Remember the femicide that was going on in Juarez about 10 years ago. These are crosses in their community when you just drive up there. So the border is a very interesting place. It's kind of a coming together of a lot of different cultures, because people have moved to the border from all over Mexico to work in these factories, from other countries also, from Central America, because there's work there. This is in Roma, Texas. They have, the Border Patrol, they have these mobile stations that they hook onto their vehicles, and they drive, and then they set up above the river with lights at night. They even have boats in there. There's blimps. The militarization of the border is massive. And it's very sad because most of the people who live on these borders, in these border towns, it's probably 95% Mexicano people on our side, on this side. So our people are living under a military
Occupation.
well, she said that. A military reality is what I'm talking about. You can call it a lot of different things, but I've always said, our people are beautiful people, and we don't deserve that. We don't deserve this. This is the image that this organization used for the flyer. This is in Oaxaca. They were having a march, and I was at a restaurant and I seen this march go by, so I took off and got around, and I asked them, what is this march about? They said it's about education. That they're marching because they want books in their schools. Books! And they wanted the government to give shoes for the kids. Think about that. And we're here at a university. This is in Tijuana, a march against the United States by students from Mexico. You see the dollar signs. It was a march against the maquila factories there in Tijuana. They're huge. You got Toshiba, Mitsubishi, you name it. All the TVs that are made there, everything. And these are students there. This woman had been deported. This is at a women's shelter in Tijuana. She had been deported, put in jail first in Los Angeles, 6 months. Then they dropped her off at the border, like 3 in the morning, and said, we'll see you. Okay. She didn't know where her kids, had no contact with her children. So I was interviewing her and she broke down crying. So I stopped the interview because it's just too much. This is down below Tucson, Arizona, down by the border. There's actual graves in the desert. I was out with the group No More Deaths putting out water. And it's been in the news now. Now they're prosecuting people for putting out water, which is ridiculous. This is in Roma, Texas, a Texas National Guardsman patrolling the border. I went up to him, I asked him if I could take the pictures of him, and then he said I had to check, so he called his captain, and the captain came and said, yeah, go ahead. You know, took these pictures, and I walked back up the levee to where my truck was, and then a border patrol pulled in on a Jeep, and he had an M16 on his seat. And he says, you know, you can't take pictures here. And I said, well, the National Guard just said I could. And he said, I said you couldn't. So I said, okay, we'll see you later. And I left. The militarization, it's heavy. Heavy weaponry there. This is Dolores Huerta. This is in 2006. Then again, I'm talking about the length of this movement here. This was at the federal building in San Francisco. The immigrant women were having a hunger strike. They were out there in tents. Dolores came and spoke. The same day, the ICE, this is the ICE building also, they came out and brought dogs to sniff all the tents. Like somehow there was bombs in there or whatever. It was disrespectful to say the least. This picture here, this image, there's an exhibit at the California Museum downtown. It starts this Saturday. And I have images in there. This is one of them. So you should all go. It's an exhibit about the life of Dolores Huerta. It's from the Smithsonian Institution. So you should all go down there, go to the website to see events and things. Okay? It's important. This is your history. This woman has dedicated her life for the betterment of all of us. Similar to, like Dr. King, Cesar Chavez, gave her life for the betterment of others. Like this man who spoke here, Dr. Luther. He's probably still here. It's very serious, these people, what they've done and what they're still doing. She's 88 years old, still out speaking. This is a poster I did after I got back from Guatemala. I said, you know, what the heck is going on here? You know, I started doing printmaking. I was a student at Davis. And this is an image from the series I did in Guatemala. I'm going to stop there. One last thing, I do a radio show on KDVS in Davis. It's the UC Davis student radio station. It's 90.3 FM. tomorrow I'm interviewing Dolores Huerta. So tune in at 5 o'clock. It's from 5 to 6. You can get it online also at kdvs.org, and it's on the archive also. So thank you very much.
Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Vargas.
My name is Maria Elena Vargas. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Ethnic Studies. I will be speaking about Guatemala. And I'm honored to be here with everyone in this panel, activists and scholars, and I'm also extremely inspired by Dr. Luther's talk. Okay. Claudia Patricia Gomez Gonzalez, Jacqueline Amey Rosemary Cal Maquis, Felipe Alonso Gomez. These are the names of Mayan migrant youth from Guatemala who were killed by Border Patrol or died under their custody. Claudia was 20 years old when a CPB agent killed her on May 23, 2018 in Rio Grande, Texas. Her case made national news because Marta Martinez, a witness, recorded the deadly encounter where she can be heard screaming at the agent, "Why do you mistreat them? Why did you shoot the girl? You killed the girl. I saw you with the gun." Claudia was killed with a bullet to the head. Martinez posted the video on her Facebook, causing it to go viral and challenging the CPB's initial account of the shooting. Claudia was buried in her hometown of San Juan Ostuncalco, Quetzaltenango, where her family and larger Mayan Mam community mourned her loss. In interviews with her mother, Lidia Gonzalez Vasquez cries for justice for her daughter and has many questions that the CPB and the FBI have left unanswered, referring only to a, quote, ongoing investigation. Jacqueline, who was only 7 years old, died on December 8th from septic shock and cardiac arrest. Felipe, a tender 8-year-old, died shortly after on Christmas Eve. Both children were under the custody of Border Patrol at the time of death. Jacqueline, who was from San Antonio Se Cortés, Alta Verapaz, belonged to the Mayan Quechí community. Felipe was from Yalamboch, Huehuetenango, and was part of the Mayan Chuj community. Both children were traveling with their fathers, who turned themselves into Border Patrol agents, and shortly after the children fell ill and experienced negligence in medical care, leading to their deaths. Claudia, Jacqueline, and Felipe all belong to disenfranchised and impoverished Mayan communities located in the rural western and northern highlands of Guatemala. The Mam, Quechí, and Chuj share Guatemala's shameful genocide legacy. The internal armed conflict, known as the longest and bloodiest civil war in Central America, started in 1960 and ended in 1996, claiming the lives of 200,000 people. 83% of those victims were Mayan, and 17% non-indigenous. According to forensic anthropologists, the Civil War consisted of two overlapping campaigns, best characterized as rural and urban. The urban campaign targeted union leaders and student activists who were captured by death squads and illegally detained. Many of these victims experienced excruciating torture aimed at extracting information from them to use against the revolutionary movement. And most of these people were the Ladino, right, the non-indigenous urban guerrilleros. The peak of the urban campaign occurred during General Lucas Garcia regime, where the rate of violent deaths that were pronounced dead at the scene rose to 25% above normal in the period of 1978 through 1983. In contrast, the rural campaign under the rule of de facto President Efraín Ríos Montt took a brutal shift in 1982. Ríos Montt believed that the historical neglect by the Guatemalan government of rural and indigenous populated areas made these vulnerable to manipulation by guerrilla groups. So simply, if you were indigenous or Maya, you were now the internal enemy. In contrast to Lucas Garcia, Ríos Montt ignored the urban region in the context of the Civil War, and rural spaces became the epicenter of the war. It was the shift from urban to rural that marked a turn towards genocide, because it placed the indigenous people in the fire of intensified militarized violence perpetrated by the state. Contrary to Guatemalan state claims that ethnicity did not play a role in the conflict and that those killed were armed civilians who supported the revolutionary groups, the counterinsurgency campaign perpetuated against indigenous men, children, women, and the elderly is known as the peak of ruthless violence during the entire 36-year Civil War. In the 2013 genocide case, which is the first of its kind to be held in the domestic court in Guatemala, former President Efraín Ríos Montt was found guilty of acting as the intellectual that ordered the military to commit 11 massacres and kill over 1,771 Ichil Mayans living in the western highlands. To truly understand the complexity of the internal armed conflict, it is necessary to study its imperial roots, entrenched in the 1954 CIA coup that overthrew President Jacobo Arbenz. For most of the 20th century, the U.S. has grown accustomed to the support of U.S. investments by the Guatemalan oligarchy. However, in 1954, Jacobo Arbenz, who was democratically elected by the Guatemalan people, served as the president. In an effort to redistribute land ownership in Guatemala, where the majority of the landless Mayan population was illiterate and living in extreme poverty in rural regions, and where 2% of the landholders owned 72% of the arable land, Arbenz proposed land reform. Arbenz's support of the Agricultural Reform Act angered the United States because much of that confiscated land was part of the land owned by the United Fruit Company. Quote, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and CIA Director Allen Dulles, brothers, mind you, convinced President Eisenhower that Arbenz had to go. On their advice, Eisenhower authorized the CIA to organize a plan between U.S. and Guatemalan landowners that used a strategy linked to Cold War anti-communist sentiments to create a political practice that portrayed the Arbenz government and its followers as communist. With the overthrow of the Arbenz government, Guatemala retained its practices of extracting economic wealth from the land of the indigenous people and maintained an amicable relationship with the United States that would extend to military aid for the Civil War. The United States government played a central role in interrupting a blooming Guatemalan democracy that was led by popular uprising and indigenous social movements, and thus responsible for the ruthless military dictators and bloodshed of the internal armed conflict. However, U.S. foreign policy in Central America is a glaring piece missing from current mainstream media reports on the Central American caravan, who focus mostly on the personal struggle of migrants and not why the reasons that they're forced to leave their homelands, such as the unlivable circumstances of poverty and violence that Guatemalan political, economic, military oligarchies have created. This homegrown structural violence has been made possible by U.S. foreign intervention, or the way that U.S. has, quote, maintained mutually beneficial political, military, and economic relations with the Guatemalan government. End of quote. These insidious relationships have historically enabled U.S. foreign intervention in Central America that continuously interrupts any semblance of democracy and implants military regimes that serve their white supremacy and capitalist interests. Graham Russell, director of Rights Action, a nonprofit organization dedicated to denouncing U.S. and Canadian policies and actions taken by U.S. and Canadian governments that incite human rights violation, decries mainstream media's omission of what he calls the elephant in the room. And these are the pictures here you see. So there's no more elephant. In terms of the lack of discussion regarding, quote, how governments and global actors are implicated in the endemic problems currently impacting Central America. Russell calls out global economic actors such as the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, hydroelectric hydroelectric dam companies, African palm, and tourist operators that, quote, maintain profitable business relationships with the corrupt, repressive elites of Guatemala and Honduras. Currently, Guatemala is experiencing a constitutional crisis in which President Jimmy Morales attempted to end a United Nations Anti-Corruption Commission called the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, the CICIG. The commission, established in 2009, has, quote, pressed corruption cases that have implicated about 680 people, including top elected officials, business people, and bureaucrats. The commission said in November that it won 310 convictions and broke up 60 criminal networks. The commission participated in an investigation that forced former Vice President Roxana Valedati and former President Otto Perez Molina, that can be seen right there with Obama, President Obama, to step down from office in 2015 because of fraud and corruption charges. End of quote. On January 8th, the Guatemalan Constitutional Court overruled, so this is just all happening right now, overruled Morales. However, the president struck back by proposing a reform that would grant amnesty to military officials accused of human rights crimes during the Civil War. The reform, known as amnesty law, would, quote, result in the immediate release of dozens of convicted war criminals responsible of the most heinous crimes against humanity unimaginable committed during the internal armed conflict, end of quote. International human rights organizations are denouncing Morales' action as a technical coup that, if passed by Congress, would be detrimental to the work and lives of human defenders and indigenous activists. And back to Jacqueline, Claudia, and Felipe, right? There's no justice for them in their homeland, nor, right, in the United States. Thank you.
Okay, we're gonna next hear from Dr. Sarabia.
Thank you for being here today. Today, Jesus and I are going to present a chapter that we're working on for a forthcoming anthology, and it's about the 21st century border, where we try to sort of bring together national policy on immigration with foreign policy by the United States. And so, where's the paper? So, on December 1st, 2018, the new president of Mexico, as Mariana mentioned, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, took office. And in that same day, he met with representatives from Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, to sign the Plan de Desarrollo Integral, the plan of integral development. Days later, the foreign minister of Mexico announced that Mexico will pledge $30 billion to help deter migration from Central America.
Yeah, and so with that being said, we had some questions, right? Some questions of critical critique, right? Particularly, where is that money coming from, right? What is the funding organization? Where's the training coming from? Who's going to provide the infrastructure for this enormous plan to limit migration, right? Previous Latin American countries had not necessarily outspokenly declared outspoken interest in limiting migration. Why all of a sudden is there an interest in funding limiting migration across the Americas?
So in this presentation, we are going to talk a little bit about the academic literature to understand this issue. Then we're going to talk about the methods, and then some of the findings and conclusions. So academics have talked about the closing of the border. Francisco mentioned the militarization of the border, the closing of the border, but less attention has been paid to the simultaneous opening of the border to certain people, right? Tourists, the cosmopolitan kind of elite. We have talked about domestic policy when it comes to migration, how this U.S. Policies and laws regarding immigration shapes the movement of people, but less attention has been paid to how foreign policy shapes movements across borders. So we hope to highlight these issues.
Yeah. And as has been highlighted in some of the previous conversations, right, that the movement of people is not accidental, that there are legal policies that inspire, that serve as catalysts for movement of people, right? So like that U.S. Foreign policy increases the movement not only of people coming up north, but then also some of the criminal policies here locally impact the movement of people back into their native countries, right?
So really quickly, we use sort of data from the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, the GAO, and we'll focus the presentation on Plan Merida. So we start with the opening of the border. If we see the number of non-immigrant visas issued by the United States annually, we see that about 10 million visas are issued annually to people who can demonstrate economic stability in their countries of origin, and in terms of pedestrians crossing along the U.S.-Mexico border, more than 100 million people cross the U.S.-Mexico border legally every year. The peak was around 2000, where almost 300 million people were crossing the U.S.-Mexico border legally. So the border is quite porous for certain people.
That's right. And so what we're seeing, or what the data suggests, is that there is still an ongoing invitation, right, to a certain type of immigrant, right? Somebody that has the resources to apply for the type of certification, the type of legal crossing of the border, right? Which is very interesting, right? That we're still sort of like the American government continues to offer visas and grant permission, right? It continues to say, come on over, come on through, come on in through these visas, right? So the invitation of a people continues to exist.
And the investment behind that. So here's an example of Cross-Border Express, CBOX, which is a new tunnel that connects the international airport in Tijuana with a port in San Diego. So you don't even have to go through the regular checkpoints. If you come to the airport, there's an opening.
I'll let you keep going.
Okay. So there's sort of like this opening for certain individuals who can mostly come from middle class, but at the same time we know about the closing of the border, but we want to highlight that this closing of the border also comes at a time of dramatic changes in the migration patterns. So mass migration from Mexico has come to an end. Today there's a net negative migration from Mexico, which means that more people from Mexico leave the United States than enter. Since 2014 around, more non-Mexicans are apprehended along the U.S.-Mexico border than Mexicans. So what is all this hype about this border crisis, this border patrol being overwhelmed? We know that migration characteristics have changed, and today the big focus is on Central American migration. And yet we also see that today Mexico deports more Central Americans than the United States. So we want to highlight what's happening.
And so, and actually, before we jump into that part, right? Like, so again, so think about it from this perspective. So the U.S. Mexico is doing a lot to invite people to come over with legal visas, right? To enter the country with travel or with limited visas, right? But at the same time, there's minimal investment in the court system, right? To process longer term stays, right? There's no pathway from somebody to enter with a temporary visa and then stay as a permanent resident. And yet we know that is how most of the folks that are undocumented now that are coming from Mexico, that is how they're entering, right? So, James Baldwin once said, like, I don't know how to measure whether or not there's racism in your heart. I can just measure the outcomes of your actions. Right? And so that's what we're using. We're saying, like, the outcomes of the actions, right, let us know that there is an intentionality to criminalize people, right? To criminalize people that come here with permits, but after they stay here, because there is no legal system for them to remain, these folks become criminalized.
Yes, and so to highlight and go back to this initial puzzle of why is Mexico invested in stopping Central American migration, why is Mexico invested in deporting Central American migrants, we turn to foreign policy. That in 2006, this is the amount of aid given from the United States to Mexico. In 2006, $66 million were given to Mexico. 2007, $65 million. 2007, $405 million. 2008, $432 million. There's a huge increase, 6 times. And this is through Merida Initiative. And so, to highlight a little bit about the Merida Initiative, there are like supposedly 4 pillars about that come with the Merida Initiative that seek to supposedly disrupt organized crime, institutionalize the rule of law in Mexico, build strong and resilient communities, whatever that means, and one of the pillars is to create a 21st century border. And about 1/5 of all the funding for the Merida Initiative goes to these specific efforts. And what these, how the 21st century border has been defined is to, and I quote, facilitate legitimate commerce and movement of people while curtailing the illicit flow of drugs, people, arms, and cash. So these are this invitation for legitimate people who can prove that they are worthy of permits to cross borders, while at the same time further policing and exerting violence on the poor people who are described and labeled as illegitimate and illegal.
And so what we're seeing is that it's doing is that the Merida project is allowing, under these premises, the U.S. to go into Mexico, not only provide funding, but also provide training on infrastructure, right? So provide training, pretty much create similar patterns of policing that the U.S. enforces here, right? So ICE entering Mexico, creating an ICE-like agency within Mexico so that Mexico can then enforce really immigration policies from the U.S. down, right? Or the values, not really the policies, but the values, right? This sort of like white supremacist, imperialistic, market-driven, capitalistic values, right? Not necessarily political, meaning because the laws themselves in the U.S. would allow for folks from Central America to apply for legal asylum, but instead, rather than allowing folks to come here, the U.S. is stopping people in Mexico through training, through funding of the Mexican government.
Yes, and so we sort of make the argument in this chapter that there's sort of the trapping of the poor, right? Even though apprehensions have gone down, and in part it's sort of this issue that Jesus touched on, that most people who enter the country unauthorized, or they come authorized with visas or temporary permits and then overstay. So less people are coming really unauthorized, there's a decrease, but at the same time there's a dramatic increase, that hasn't stopped, the staffing of Border Patrol. The budget for Border Patrol has not slowed down. And we hear Mr. Trump, right, demanding a wall, even though we know, again, that most people don't come unauthorized. And the last data is sort of this issue that Jesus touched on, sort of like where the funding is going. Most of it, the orange is Border Patrol, the blue is ICE, so sort of policing at the border, policing within the United States, and the red are sort of funding for courts. So there's no way to move people from these temporary permits to a more permanent status, and those people who are coming to the border who need to go through the court system because they're applying for asylum, there are just no resources.
Yeah. And so our argument is two-part, right? On the one end, we see the limited migration of folks from Latin America and Central America up north by the funding of the Mexican government and the development of agencies within the country of Mexico, right? But then we also see the criminalization of people, mostly that come from Mexico, with visas once they arrive here, right? So it's the creation of a poorer working class. Most of these folks do not arrive as self-defined poor labor working class, right? The simple fact that they were able to get visas would let us know that they're a part, that they have the resources. Yet when they come here and become undocumented, now they're a part of a second-class citizenship, right? So the development of second-class citizenship here in the United States through these programs, but also the limitation of mobility of central immigrants moving north.
And so just to conclude, again, we sort of touch on the opening of the border, the simultaneous opening and closing of the border, and the trapping of the poor through various means, through not allowing free movements of people, through creating these legal categories that criminalizes them once they are here. But that we want to sort of end with this issue of the consequences, right? Even though, again, migration has slowed down, at least from Mexico, from undocumented people or coming unauthorized, the deaths amongst undocumented migrants has not slowed down. More than 6,000 people have died since the militarization of the border intensified in the 1990s. And just that thousands of immigrant children, like the ones that Maria talked about, have been reporting sexual assault. Not 4, not 40 or 400. More than 4,500 children have reported being sexually abused. And the response of our government, of the United States government, is to say we're not responsible for the actions of staff.
And so that, obviously we want to highlight this, right? But we also want to highlight and invite for critical thought and critical perspective that while popular discourse is being focused on the creation of a border wall, right? Like, well, that's part of popular mainstream discourse, right? And I'm not saying that that's not an important part, that what we're seeing is that through the processes is that the wall is now, it's not about the wall between the US and Mexico, but instead the creation of the nation of Mexico as itself being the wall, right? Turning a country into a wall, turning a country into a border, right? Expanding the border and all of the crimes that happen at the border, all of the violence that happens at the border, right? And it continues to be funded through public dollars, continues to be expanded through US sanctioned training. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you again to all of our panelists. We have just a few minutes left if there are any questions from the audience now. And then after we finish our question and answer session, we'd like to invite everyone to stay for a reception afterwards. There'll be some food and refreshments provided, as well as enjoying the art next door. Are there any questions? Anyone have anything they want to ask the panel?
Oh.
I have a comment.
Oh, yeah.
And can I make a comment? Oh.
I have a comment too.
I'll give it back to the panel then.
Yeah.
We can go back down.
Yes, real quick. One of the things I've been covering on my radio show in Davis is the YOLO Juvenile Detention Center in Woodland, California, which Health and Human Services has contracted with the Yolo County Juvenile Hall to house immigrant youth from Central America. There was an LA Times article that came out last week talking that, Attorney General Becerra did a report specifically on that and documented the abuses that are taking place. And this is right here in our own backyard here in Woodland, where it has already been documented that they have been forcibly drugging those youth with psychotropic drugs, saying that they're crazy and depressed, so they're going to drug them, and they're suicidal. They're also, in this report, it said they were reports of some of the kids being beaten by the guards, So this is happening today, and it's just outrageous amongst everything else that's going on. So keep your ears open to this one, because this has been going on for 11 years there. This center has been opened up for its the last 11 years, and they just, Yolo County has just voted to get more money from the federal government to expand, to hire 9 more people. So that's infrastructure. So they're saying they're going to build the best immigrant detention center for youth in the United States, right here in our backyard.
Hi, so I wanted to highlight one quick thing about really seeing indigenous communities that we were talking about today from Central America that are migrating north, as really centering them as frontline communities in the climate change moment that we're in. These are communities that were already at the front lines of intense extractivism, extractive-based economic models. And so, that over a long period of time has intensified the effects of what we're seeing as climate change. And so the folks, I mentioned that, the foreign policy like the North American Free Trade Agreement or the Central American Free Trade Agreement, how they disproportionately affected poor subsistence farmers. Well, those farmers that were able to continue, that were able to withstand that those economic oppressions are not really able to withstand the climate change patterns that make it extremely difficult to continue living off of the land. And so the migration that we're seeing is also based on climate change. And so we really need to center indigenous communities when we talk about migration, when we talk about climate change and responses to climate change, because I think we're at a point where it's too late to stop it, where we really need to, how are we going to adapt to it? And then I also wanted to point out how interesting the indigenous communities are positioned politically in Central and Latin America as anti-extractivist activists, and how sometimes that puts them on the opposite sides of the supposedly progressive governments that need indigenous communities in their coalitions on their rise to power. And so when leftist countries fail, or leftist governments fail to move beyond an extractivist economic model, this is when the political project of the left begins to fracture. And so it's extremely critical that we see a response to climate change, not just in the United States, but throughout Latin America as a way to fundamentally change our economic models in relation to raw material and human capital.
Okay, there was just one other, or something I really wanted to say was that Subcomandante Marcos, one time, he was a leader at one point, and he was being interviewed, and what he was asked was if he had a message for the Mexicano people who were in the United States. And his answer was, yes. Tell them that the Zapatistas rose up in rebellion and were fighting back and resisting because we want no one else, no other Mexicano to ever have to leave their homeland in order to survive. And I remember saying this on the radio. I was up in Chico, and somebody from Redding drove down to where we had just done this radio show. She drove because we were at some anti-tool 9 or some we're doing something activist. Anyway, this woman shows up at our table and says, "Were you the 2 women who were on the radio just a little bit ago?" And we said, "Yeah." And she started crying. She just cried and cried, and I said, "What's the matter?" And she said, "I'm embarrassed, I'm ashamed that I left and I didn't stay and fight." And that's kind of what, a lot of people come north right? A lot of people come here, or they move to the cities and the border, and eventually they get here. But I want you to know that there's other, I mean, we don't just give up, okay? We can't give up. And the Zapatistas are an example. When I used to do presentations with little kids at schools, I would ask them, God, what if there was a situation where your kids were starving and sick and you had no work? What would you do? And I'd have them stand up and act it out. And lots of times they would say, I would get out of there. I wouldn't want to be poor like that. I wouldn't want to see my kids starve. And you would just leave, huh? Yeah. You know, and I said, well, is there any other alternative? And they go, I guess you could stay there and die. That's little kids, that's how they saw it. When I asked them, if it was bad, what would you do? And so they never, none of them ever, in all those years that we did that kind of presentation with kids, did they say we could stay and fight. Lots of times it's not considered an alternative, right, or an option. But today, the doctor who was here with us, he was talking about fighting back and resisting, and that's what this is going on around the world. Indigenous people are organizing and fighting back, and we have to support that. And you know, our little solidarity group, we did a lot of things to support their movement. I think, you know, I remember working on this in Salvador, Nicaragua, all of those things. You know, those are, you know, if you grow up as an activist and you're thinking about what's going on in the world, your heart leads you to participate and do something about it. And that's the example that we're following with the Zapatistas. I'm really concerned that they're going to be attacked, and they've already been attacked. They're going to be attacked more. And under this new system, there's a new president who's making them, like everybody believes he's going to be good. And so if you hear of them being attacked, you know that his words are different from his actions. You know, and that's scary to us because they could disappear, all of them. And we have to be ready to defend them. Thank you.
That's going to conclude the panel. Could we give one more round of applause? Thank you so much for coming. Hopefully, many of you can hang out for the reception as well and have some great conversations. Thank you.